This is our last full topic for the term, which is reconstructing the social and ideological aspects of culture. I'm basically using that as a catch-all to represent or capture a whole bunch of different kinds of things that archaeologists attempt to reconstruct about people, what people were doing in the past. And so there's, again, a lot of topics that I want to touch briefly upon here. So first, types of societies. So we'll look at groups, and then we'll look at individuals, and then we'll look at ideology or worldview through the mechanism of understanding ritual spaces. So I want you to think back to the first part of the term when we were looking at scale, and remember that the scale at which we conduct our research or do our research questions allows us to get at different aspects of society, right? That within individual households, we can really get at individuals, we can really get at the social uses of houses and space. But with regional analysis, now we're looking at larger issues relating to group identity, to social organization, and whatnot. Now, traditionally, archaeologists used to follow the kind of major categories of types of societies, talking about bands and tribes and chiefdom states and empires. Recently, we've shifted away from some of this terminology because it's very colonial in nature. But again, this idea that how we organize societies follow kind of key patterns relating to the evidence that we can use to do this still holds somewhat true, right? But rather we've kind of moved away from kind of unilineal evolutionary thinking that all societies started as bands and then were kind of quote unquote meant to evolve into empires. Now we just see kind of what was the current status of this particular group, of this particular society at the time period that we are studying them, or how they've changed over time. Okay, so some of the evidence we use relates to attempts to reconstruct population sizes. Of course, we can get at sizes of settlement, which will tell us something about population sizes. We've already talked about territoriality a little bit in terms of seasonality of sites and movements of people. And subsistence strategies. Of course, we can look at differences in household compositions, but also variation in the kinds of structures that are present, right? Are they all households? Do we have monumental architecture? Do we have a marketplace? Do we have central places of ritual or worship, etc.? Of course, we look at distribution of material remains to get at different kinds of sites. So again, are we looking at workshops or campsites, or what kind of site do we have? We also look for evidence of things like specialization, right? And this again is feeds into our understanding of things like technology, because we will look at things like, does there appear to be a pottery industry, or is this a stone tool industry, or basketry, or whatever? We can look at the iconography that's being used. We'll talk about symbols later on in this topic. And of course, really getting at, in terms of the lived experience of people, we want to look at mortuary data as well. And so we talked about that last topic in bioarchaeology. Okay. So we're going to look briefly at some of these different ways of how archaeologists have interpreted societies. And one of the things we can look at is Robert Foley's territory model, looking at how bands, so small groups of people, were exploiting resources within their area. And so what Foley's model kind of does is sees people within these kind of band structures loosely defining the world on the basis of the resources they have available to them and their ability to travel and acquire or procure those resources. So what he did was he plotted all the known artifacts from a given area within a hunter-gatherer settlement to look at what, and not just within their settlement, but within their range, to look at basically how they were utilizing the landscape. And you can see that he was able to capture a whole bunch of different kinds of activities, areas where people might be gathering or foraging for resources, areas where fuel could be procured, of course, water areas as being critical for obtaining water, which we need to live. He has a lithic source on here, temporary camps that are associated with things like animal migration routes, right? So we can imagine, again, seasonality, that people would live in these camps when animals are moving through this route and then move back to their home base. And so the idea is that we can do this by looking at artifact clustering, right? That's how we can reconstruct this, that the higher clustering of artifacts is going to be where activities was most intense. And you saw this when you did the mapping exercise, looking at the density of artifacts across the space, attempting to predict how many sites were present based on higher frequencies of artifact numbers. The other category of society we can look at aside from bands then are segmentary societies. And this is when we start to see a shift away from kind of foraging patterns into small scale growing of plants or domestication or herding of animals. So here we see, rather than kind of these territory models, we start to talk about villages and kind of settlement patterns of villages. When we look at things like states, we tend to look for things like administration. This is because now we have really large population sizes. And so in order to make sure that everyone in the population is getting their resources that they need, that the state has the resources it needs in order to operate, we need to have things like an administration with a writing system. Again, we start to see cross-specialization because not everyone is involved in food procurement. We see a road system allowing people to move freely or at least move easily between things like settlements and resource procurement areas, or even areas where resources are being grown. And then we need to have things like armies in order to maintain control over these regions. But I already mentioned that this kind of society type approach is problematic because of its colonial origins, but also because it obscures some of the variability in the archaeological record. For example, in world prehistory, we talk about how you can have states that don't have cities, or you can find cities that aren't associated with state complexes, right? Or state level political organization. It also fails to predict what we might expect archaeologically because, as you know, there's a preservation bias in the archaeological record. And again, one of the key things is the role of things like colonialism and how it perpetuates inequality, along with other structural mechanisms that promote inequality in societies as well, that may, again, impact the distribution of things like resources and, again, other aspects of social organization. So a lot of archaeologists have shifted towards reconstructing inequality instead because the archaeological record does have evidence for differences in status of individuals and accesses to resources within a group. And so rather than seeing societies as a type, we start to talk about them in terms of whether or not we think they were egalitarian, where everyone in the group had equal status and access to resources, or at least roughly equal status and access to resources. If they're ranked, where everyone has different status, or if it's stratified, where there are significant differences between the classes. So again, this instead is fairly easy or relatively easier to interpret in terms of the archaeological record, and accounts for a lot more variability than just simply saying, oh, this was a state or a segmentary society such as a chiefdom or a band. But it's not just about getting at inequality, it's also getting at identity, because of course inequality can manifest itself in many different forms, because we may have gender equality in a particular group, but then we may have age-based inequality or vice versa. So getting at sex and gender, getting at age, getting at ethnic identities, at descent groups, all of these things are really critical. And we can get at these kind of things by looking at mortuary data, by looking at nutrition and diet. And what I want to talk about the rest of this topic, or for a significant part of the rest of this topic, is by looking at things like symbols. But first, a quick comment. Those of you who've taken courses like our Anthropology 110 are already familiar that in anthropology, we recognize a difference between sex and gender in terms of how they are constructed. So both are constructed culturally. However, we make a distinction between them because this is something we see similarly cross-culturally, that there is a recognition that there are observable physical differences between males and females. Increasingly, we're talking more in our culture about intersex variation. But then with gender, what we're talking about is the social aspect relating to roles, ideology, and behavior that are often attributed to members of the various sexes, right? So it's how we're expected to behave and think and feel and perform within a society. However, defining gender, even from an archaeological perspective, can be extremely challenging. I talk a lot about this in my Anth 320 Archaeology of Gender course, but I just want to introduce it here, that we have to remember that when we are looking at gender in the archaeological record, we have to look for something that is non-stable. It's always changing. It's not an objective identity. It's a subjective identity. We see this again in our discourse around gender today, that even how people define something like man or woman, or queer or non-binary or genderqueer, or all of these different categories of gender have a subjectivity to them, right? It's because they're experienced as individuals. And what this means then is that they're expressed and affected in many different ways. And this is then going to impact the material culture that we're using to interpret gender, right? So it's also not a matter of focusing on, again, kind of quote unquote alternative genders. It's not even really about the different questions of how we define gender, but it's often a question of whether or not we can actually even get at gender in the archaeological record, considering how problematic it can be to understand and interpret gender from a contemporary perspective. Part of the issue we have is often the own lens, our own cultural lens that we bring to our interpretations. So most Westerners, or as I say here, Euro-Americans, recognize a dichotomy of two genders and two sexes, that there are two sexes, male and female, that represent two genders, male and female, and we refer to this broadly as heteronormativity. But other societies, including our own, increasingly do recognize that gender is much more complicated than this, as do we see, again, an increasing recognition that even sex is not simply a heteronormative male and female dichotomy as well. So what then is gender? Well, it's a continuum, it's a cloud, it's a spectrum, it's complex. So when we talk about archaeology of gender, I tend to say it's more of an archaeologies of gender. And really, there's several goals behind how we do archaeologies of gender. And again, if you're really interested in this, come take 320 with me, where we really get into this. I talk about how a lot of challenges to kind of the traditional heteronormative androcentric approach that we take to understanding people in the past was challenged in the 60s and 70s. Of course, this is in line with other broader socio-political movements, the human rights movement, the second wave feminism. And then it emerged as a field in the 1980s in archaeology. And so this is where we actually start in seeing people talking about this in the archaeological literature. So that's where we begin our journey in 320s, by reviewing some of this early literature in the 1980s. So I mentioned that a lot of this was to question traditional androcentric models, ones like man the hunter, but also starting to question gender as necessarily inherently linked with things like biology. And so I touched upon it briefly, but didn't get into it too much in our bioarchaeology topic. But it's important to separate and distinguish between gender and sex because of how we interpret these things in the archaeological record, and also some of the challenges we even have with sex estimation as well. And another major theme was addressing invisibility in representation and in the profession. So not just representation in terms of models of people in the past that tended to neglect the contributions predominantly of women and children in the archaeological record, but also in the profession as well, that if we look at histories of archaeology, and I mentioned this way at the beginning of the term, we see a lot of narratives relating to what I always call kind of jokingly, but also not jokingly, the old white dudes, right? And so we don't see a lot of visibility of women archaeologists. And we talked about how this is inherently false, that women have been an integral part of the development of archaeology, continuing and the ongoing discipline today. So we can study gender itself and how archaeologists have studied gender, or we can look at how archaeologists represent gender, or we can do both. We can look at the cultural construction of gender, and also sexuality often comes into play with this, because part of heteronormativity is not only is this idea that we have two sexes, male and female, and two genders, male and female, but these two sexes and genders are inherently sexually attracted to each other and only each other, right? So that heterosexuality is the normative idea. So we have to kind of challenge these ideas as well. And most of these challenges come with just this idea that can we understand the past without applying assumptions about things like gender and heteronormativity, right? Or heterosexuality, that, and there's significant examples and evidence that supports other gender constructions and also other sexualities, right? And then finally, we can also look at things like gender inequity in the practice of archaeology itself. And so in 320, we look at who's publishing in archaeology, who has careers and jobs in archaeology, who becomes professors, so who's teaching archaeology, and all of these kind of other issues, ethical issues that have impacted who archaeologists are. And then we apply an intersectional approach where we also move away from archaeology as being so white. And so we introduce, for example, a Black feminist archaeology framework to the course. So that's what I'm mentioning here on this slide, is this idea of intersectionality, that we cannot look at just gender. We have to consider all of the other factors that relate to an individual's identity, class, age, etc., that impact that person's experience, that person, basically their humanness, what their life was like, right? So all of these kinds of things are important. So we spend some time looking at the importance and significance and value of an intersectional model to understanding the past. Around the same time that archaeologies of gender emerged, archaeologies of children and childhood emerged, because clearly we have to have children in order to have adults, but they're really not discussed a lot in models about what life was like in the past. We spend a lot of time talking about adults and their work, but what about children? And so there's been a lot of discussion and discourse since the 1980s around how children are not seen in the archaeological record, that they're kind of invisible. And there's a lot of discussion around this idea of, well, are they inconspicuous, or actually are they present in the archaeological record? We're just not seeing them because, for example, with evidence of learning, if we see a poorly shaped pot, we tend to think, oh, well, that was someone who was learning how to make pottery, but we often don't then think, oh, that someone who was learning was probably a child. We always just have this default idea of adults because of how we have adults in our culture, but also evidence of play, right? Some of these figurines we find of animals or even people, why do we necessarily always assume that they have a ritual purpose when, and we'll talk about that in a second, how we actually can get at ritual. Why do we not think, well, why are they play? Right? And so I want you to think about then the spaces you may go through in your life, in your day-to-day activities, and think about where and how children may be present, and then think about how that can be then complicated in order to interpret in the archaeological record itself. And we do have some representations of children, but very few in the archaeological record overall, and this is really interesting. And so as a result of this, we've seen the rise of things like the Society for the Study of Childhood in the Past, or wonderful volumes like this one, The Archaeology of Childhood by Jane Eva Baxter. Okay. So how then do we actually get at things like ritual and religion? Some of you might have seen memes or jokes around the idea that archaeologists often default to this interpretation when we don't know what something means, right? And part of this is because when we don't know what something means, then chances are it's because we're not part of that culture and we don't have the appropriate context to interpret it, right? So in Blackboard Collaborate last week, we talked about this particular symbol and what it means and some of the challenges we have with ascertaining the meanings of these symbols. We can look at symbols very broadly, however, because we do know that symbols are used in very particular ways. So symbols are used for regulating and organizing relations between humans. So money is a good example of this. Money is a symbol. Badges are a symbol, not just of army rank like I've provided here, but you could imagine how we use badges or symbols to indicate other forms of identity, right? Think about the tattooing and the patches that were sewn on the clothing of people under the Nazi regime in Germany during World War II, right? That's a way of regulating and organizing relations between humans, right? These are humans that are us, and these are humans that are not us, and humans who are not us are problematic and need to be treated in these ways, right? At least that was what was constructed under that particular regime. But we have tons of examples of this in our recent past and even today that we can use to understand this. I'm going to talk a little about the second point a little bit more, this idea that we use symbols to regulate and represent human relations with the supernatural. We use symbols to measure time, length, and weight. And so here's examples of some standardization of measurement from a marketplace. We can, on the left is an example of a water clock looking at the measurement of time. We can record and document, right, our writing system. So this is an image capturing some of the earliest writing systems that are found in different parts of the world at different periods of time. Oh, I'll just mention that interestingly, a lot of the earliest records seem to be like accounting, like just basically lists of things. And this actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because I don't know if you do this. I do this a lot. It's probably the archaeologist in me, but I'm always looking at the ground and I'm always finding things and picking things up. Not so much now because of COVID, but I used to. But one of the most common thing I find, aside from coins, although I don't see a lot of coins anymore because of debit cards and whatnot and e-transfers. But I find a lot of shopping lists, right? But it also reflects the places I go, right? But think about how many of us make lists and how we then lose those lists. So we shouldn't be surprised that a lot of the earliest documents we find would reflect kind of what people make a lot of, which is lists, and things like inventories are really important. And you can imagine for accounting purposes, like keeping track of warehouse stores and stuff like that would all be very critical. We can use symbols to delineate territory and space. So in the notes below, I talk about the site of Teotihuacan in Mexico, and how space was and planning for the city was built into the city, and you can see evidence of that in the archaeological record in the form of markers and whatnot. Of course, we can describe our world using symbols. So here's some examples of some different paintings. I like the one on the left in particular because it's an Egyptian painting showing how they moved one of these kind of megalithic structures into place. Of course, it reads almost like a comic book panel, right? It's a little bit different. It's not as vital, but that represents the aesthetic tradition of that time period. But it also shows that, yes, humans could erect massive monuments, including the pyramids. Okay, it wasn't aliens. The one on the right, on the other hand, I believe is Assyrian, and you see it's a lot more dynamic. It has a bit of a different artistic tradition, but it shows the same activity of a whole bunch of workers moving a statue into place using things like ropes and little rollers, wooden rollers and stuff underneath them. I also wanted to talk about this a little bit more in terms of representation, in terms of art. And so we spent some time talking about this in the Blackboard Collaborate lecture. So please do review that, looking at how we approach or study art, right? And all of these are valid ways, but they're going to tell us different pieces of information about the people who created the art and the society in which this art was being produced. So let's talk about artifacts then, because artifacts also can serve as symbols in some sort of way as well because of stylistic variation we see, right? That we see traits associated with decoration in artifacts. And we looked at this in our technology lab. But we also have to recognize that many artifacts have a utilitarian component as well, a functional component, right? So they serve some sort of purpose. So style, because it's culturally culturally dependent, can be difficult to analyze. But function, on the other hand, is quite easy for us to get at, right? We can often get at it through experimental archaeology. So a lot of archaeologists then have kind of seized this idea of stylistic variation and wanted to address what its significance is. And that brings us to the work of some of the key figures for this topic. So Martin Wops argued actually against a simple style versus function dichotomy, arguing that style does itself have a function. It's something that's used actively by those people who are producing the artifacts, and it reflects their intentional and intended choices to communicate particular messages. So every time I wear my McEwen hoodie, I am using that to reflect something intentional, right? That I am a member of the McEwen community. And every time I choose to wear my McEwen hoodie in a context with other people who are not part of that community, it really singles me out as a member of that community, right? Because they see it and they go, oh, she must be connected with McEwen University in some sort of way. Right? So even though I put my hoodie on because it keeps me warm and cozy on these cold winter days, its style also has a function of communicating something to the group, right? And I purchased this particular hoodie because I like the particular design and I like being affiliated with the institution that I love working at, right? So his argument makes a lot of sense. So then the question became saying, okay, if we don't look at this as a dichotomy, we still have to recognize the fact that there is stylistic variation. And also that style is used in different kinds of ways. So how are people choosing to make these style differences on artifacts? How are they using symbolic decoration? And Polly Weisner's work on African projectile points showed that style can be seen in two different ways. So we can have emblemic style. This is forms of style that are meant to convey information to other groups of people, right? So again, wearing a McEwen hoodie is a form of emblemic style because I'm saying, hey, everyone who sees me, I'm part of McEwen. This is a group I belong to, right? Assertive style, on the other hand, is meant to convey information about the maker's personal identity, mostly to the group in which they live, right? So this is where some of the variations might come about. So even though I wear a McEwen hoodie proudly all of the time, I don't often wear the McEwen sweatpants to teach, and because of ideas around what professors should wear what they teach, right? So instead I choose to wear a hoodie because that's seen as relatable and accessible and appropriate for me. But if I were to show up in like the full-on hoodie and sweatpant thing, students might be like, oh, you're expressing a little bit something about your identity, right? Maybe a little too casual, maybe not formal enough. And people seeing me walk down the street would be less likely to see me as a professor and more likely to see me as a student, right? So this is one of those things that it's both these objects have a functional purpose, but there's stylistic purposes, and then there's also individual preferences in terms of what we choose to do. And so Sakic then kind of questioned Weisner's conclusions and said that there's not just these two emblemic and assertive forms of style, but there's also something he called isochrestic style. And he said, well, listen, we ultimately have to get at this idea of choice, right? So what is shaping Dr. Biittner's decision, for example, to wear hoodies and not McEwen sweatpants, right? Well, it's shaped by the traditions of the culture in which I've been enculturated, right? Or the culture in which I've learned the appropriate ways of thinking and feeling and behaving, right? And so I grew up in a tradition where profs didn't wear sweatpants. At least in a classroom environment, right? That profs wore and look a certain thing, but wearing a school hoodie was seen as a sign of school spirit, of solidarity, and so it was seen as appropriate, right? So my decision there actually represents a form of isochrestic style. All right. Okay. So the last piece I wanted to talk about then is how do we then get at things like ideologies, because ideologies also shape the decisions we make on individual and group levels. So I provided a bit of background on religion and how it's defined, but I wanted to focus on ritual because of its inclusion of material culture, therefore leaving an archaeological signature. So what are the signatures that we can find of ritual in the archaeological record? Well, first, because ritual involves heightened awareness and or focused attention of its participants, we see special locations or buildings or special artifacts that are used to designate a ritual space. And so this is through repetition of symbols. So the idea is that we go to this designated space, we know it's a space for ritual activity because of the kinds of symbols that are being utilized. This delineation or designation of a ritual space is also critical because it's part of the ritual. There's a recognition of a boundary between worlds, particularly the physical world, the world in which we live, and the supernatural world. And this is normally illustrated through iconography. Ooh, that's a weird word for me to say. I don't know. I can't pronounce that correctly. Oh, well. Or architecture. And so I gave you this example of this gate that I saw when I was in Mexico City at the National Museum of Anthropology. And what's so interesting is all the symbols on this gate, on this doorway, are signaling that you're entering the mouth of the gatekeeper of the underworld. And so by going through this passageway, you're going into the underground, and all the murals on the back behind me inside the ritual space relate to this, right? So there's this clear separation of a public space right outside of the temple and inside of this temple, which is a private space. Of course, symbols can also be used to represent the presence of a deity or other supernatural force that could be present as well. This may be in the form of an idol. In this case, this is the under reconstruction and actually archaeological excavation when I was there, at least. This is the temple of Quetzalcoatl, or the feathered serpent at Teotihuacan, and it's covered in all these feathered serpent heads, right? So pretty clearly, this building has something to do with the feathered serpent, right? Okay. And then lastly, One of the other things that is involved in ritual activity is offering, right? That there is a sacrifice and an offering that is part of ritual activity, and often because it involves material component, we can find evidence of this. And so this is an example of a Mayan frieze, and what we see in the pictographs here is explaining the date at which event occurred. There is an individual who is doing some bloodletting. They are drawing this thorned cord through their lip or their tongue, which means that blood then gets on it. This cord would then be burned, and then that was how the blood was basically offered in the form of smoke to a particular deity. And we know this because of the individual who is letting the blood. It's the captive who is being forced to do this, and also the person who is the captor of the captive. Okay, so the last point we can get at, and this kind of summarizes all of these topics, is that clearly people's relationship with landscapes is something really important for archaeologists to get at, right? That we are utilizing resources from our landscape, and as such we tend to enculture our landscapes, right? That we name places, we build monuments, we build roads, we apply stories to these places. And so in many societies, it's our landscape that is kind of shaping us as well, right? What technologies we have available to use and we develop relate to what resources are available in our landscape, and even the landscape itself may shape our ideology, right? Our understanding of maybe undergrounds as sacred spaces might be reflective of the caves and other underground spaces that are found in our landscape. Inversely, if we don't have caves, then maybe the underground is not a place that is part of our ideology or our worldview. And so we say that this process of landscape enculturation changes spaces, so locations, physical locations with no cultural meaning, into places, locations that are tied to culture. And a good example of this might be from something you might have heard, this idea of the difference between a house and a home, right? A house is a space, right? It's a location that doesn't have personal meaning, right? There's lots of houses that we're surrounded by, but our home is our place. It's something that we are tied to, we are connected to. So I've given you just one example of this. This is a work of my friend Jason. I've talked about his work before. He was involved in the Mercator et al. Project looking at chimpanzee archaeological sites. And what he was attempting to understand was something called Covus caches. And what he argued was that these were a mechanism to enculture the landscape, to convert previously unknown spaces into culturally significant places. And what he says is that, this is a really reasonable interpretation, and he makes a very strong argument based on the available evidence, but he also says that these kinds of symbolic interpretations can be really challenging to prove, right? So in this case, we have to say, hey, this makes a lot of sense. This is a very straightforward explanation. It's supported by the evidence, but we don't know. And why do we not know? Because we can't talk to the people who ultimately produced them to find out what their intention of this act was. So that's it for this topic. If you have any questions about this last video, don't hesitate to contact me.